The Fletcher Seventh-day Adventist Church is a Christian people who believe Jesus is the Son of God, the hope of the world, who died on the cross to redeem us all for eternal life with God. Our purpose is to lift Jesus up and love people in. Visit our website at www.fletchersda.org. And now be blessed by the Holy Spirit as you listen to a Bible message by Pastor Ivan Blake.
Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these?
Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee.
Feed my lambs. Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me?
Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee.
Feed my sheep. Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me?
Lord, thou knowest all things. Thou knowest that I love thee.
Feed my sheep. Verily, verily, I say unto thee, when thou wast young, thou girdest thyself and walkest whither thou wouldst. But when thou shalt be old, thou shalt stretch forth thy hands, and another shall gird thee and carry thee whither thou wouldst not. Follow me.
Lord, and what shall this man do?
If I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee? Follow thou me.
Sometimes stories of imagination tell a powerful truth, such as the imaginary story of the 1960s from the series called The Twilight Zone. And in that particular one, there's an American traveler who goes into Europe and finds himself in Central Europe one night when suddenly it starts raining so hard. In fact, it's storming. And in this pelting rain, he's looking for shelter, and he comes upon this castle, an ancient medieval castle. Discovers that it's occupied by a group of recluse monks, but they reluctantly let him in. And as he roams around in that castle that night, he discovers there's a man held as a prisoner. There's a huge wooden bar that locks the door, and there the prisoner is stuck in that cell. He befriends the American traveler, and they begin to talk, and the prisoner says to him, I'm being held here not only against my will, but I'm held here cruelly by a madman. He's the chief monk here, and his name is Jerome. He is completely insane, and he is keeping me here, and he shouldn't. Well, the American traveler is listening to the story, and he's very impressed by the gentle tone of the prisoner. His voice is very soothing, and his appearance is very compelling. And he is taken in by this prisoner and begins to think to himself, maybe this prisoner is being held here for the wrong reasons, unjustly and cruelly. And he's compelled to then go to Jerome, Father Jerome, and he confronts him and he says, what is this that you're keeping this man here in this prison? And Jerome says to him, oh, you just don't know. That prisoner is nobody else but the devil himself, the father of lies. And he has been held captive here by the rod of truth, the one thing that he cannot escape, the rod of truth. And we are holding him here because he is the devil. And with that, of course, the American traveler thinks to his mind, ha, yeah, right. He doesn't look like the devil to me. This must be an insane man, Jerome, who's keeping this man in prison. And so later that night, when no one was watching, the American traveler went over and he lifted that bar and he opened the door. And immediately the prisoner reverts to his demonic appearance, and in a puff of smoke he vanishes. There stands the traveler, stunned and shocked with what he has done. And he goes to Jerome and he wants to apologize, but Jerome is very gentle with him. Actually, he's very sympathetic with him. He says, I'm so sorry for you, because for the rest of your life, you're going to be thinking back and remembering this night when you let the devil loose on the world. And the traveler was very disturbed by this, and he says, but I didn't believe you. He didn't look like anything that could resemble the devil. I didn't recognize him. And with that, Jerome says that's exactly the human problem. We don't recognize the devil. And that's exactly Satan's strength, that we don't recognize him. We don't know what a master he is at lulling us into a comfortable position where we feel cozy with the devil, deceived. So I'm wondering, if you think about your own life, are you able to detect when you are deceived? Are you aware of approaching deception? Is it something that, I can see this coming, I am ready for it? Are you deceived and not knowing it? Well, take what God says here in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 9. He says, the human heart is the most, what's the word? Deceitful of all things and beyond cure. The older translations say, and some other word there, this is the real language of the Hebrews, and that is, it is beyond cure. Not just desperately wicked, as the other translations say, is beyond cure. And who really knows how bad it is? This is a quote from God through Jeremiah, his opinion of what our hearts are like. It's not very pretty, is it? Now, Peter, the man that we are reading about here in the last passage of the Gospel of John, Peter is a poster child of one who is so deceived that he doesn't even know it. So deceived, pitifully deceived, self-deceived. His heart is so deceived. Peter is that person. The deception of the human heart that you find in Peter. Well, maybe you remember when Peter was in the courtyard. Remember that? While Jesus was on trial, not too far away from that. And Peter is there at a fire, and he's surrounded by servants and commoners and guards, and they're just warming themselves up. And 3 times Peter is confronted with a question. Aren't you a follower of that man? And 3 times, what does Peter do? He denies it. 3 times. He denies even knowing Jesus. 3 times. Now, this is actually a far bigger issue than what we realize. Because first of all, Peter wasn't just one of the 12 disciples. He was one of the 3 in the inner circle, together with James and John. That means that Peter and the other 2 were closer to Jesus than any human being could ever be at that time. So when you think that it's this man from the inner circle that can deny even knowing Jesus 3 times, that makes it a whole lot more serious, don't you think? Now, Peter is also the only man of the 12 who openly and publicly boasts that he is better than the others because they may forsake Jesus, but me? No, Jesus. Of all these people, I love you the most. I will rather go with you to prison and to death than to abandon you. He boasts that openly. So that makes it a whole lot more serious in what Peter is doing. The question is, did he keep his promise? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But listen, let's cut him some slack. You know, we all make mistakes. We get blindsided. We get put on the spot. And we slip once. You know, it's kind of human to err. This is just the way we are. And we would say, you know, that really, I failed that time. I know that, but that's not really who I am. The only issue is that if you do it a third time, that is who you are. When you do something like that 3 times, that is your heart. Peter, there is no getting away from this thing. You have a deceived heart, desperately wicked, beyond cure. Peter is exposing himself as very, very deceived, more than he even understands. That's your heart, Peter. He doesn't know himself. He's incurable. And to make it even worse, in Matthew 26, the record that comes from Matthew, in verse 74, it says that the third denial that Peter gave of knowing Jesus, he calls down curses from where? From heaven. It's as if Peter is saying, may I be cursed by God if I am a follower of this man. Wow. Now, you've got to understand, in those days, Peter lived in a culture that made a big deal out of loyalty. This was a shame and honor society. And honor and loyalty meant everything, which means that Peter's loyalty, meaning so much in that society, would have kept him from denying being a follower of Jesus if indeed he was. So that people listening to him and hearing him deny Jesus, they were totally convinced. This man cannot be a follower of this man who's being tried. Just impossible. His loyalty would not permit that. You know, Peter just couldn't have dreamed that he would be so bad, so deceived, that he would ever sink so low and reject Jesus. He could never dream that. But a deceitful heart doesn't need to dream a thing. It's there. It reminds me of a story that I read a long time ago. And because it was written a long time ago, I can't forget it because it made a big impact on me. Here's this boy. His father died. No brothers, no sisters. It was him and his mom alone. And they lived there in a very poor part of town, and actually they were very, very poor. But this mom was so committed that she was going to make every effort to make sure that this boy of hers would get through college. She would not allow anything to prevent him from shining and becoming a success. He went off to college many miles away from home. She hadn't seen him now for 4 years. But during those 4 years, she slogged like a slave, collecting every penny she could find and sent it off to pay the bills, to buy him clothes. She sent him pretty little packages with goodies to enjoy. This was her pride. She lived for this. This was what she was devoted to her whole life, skimping and saving, neglecting herself. And then graduation came. How do you think she felt? She goes there to this college, and there she sees him. She recognizes him, of course. There he stands. He stands like a nobleman, dressed beautifully. His posture is upright. His chin is up. He's got a smile on his face. He's surrounded by his friends. This is the moment. Looks like success in person. And she runs up to him. And she looks like she comes out of the back streets of some city. And no money to even afford to go to a beauty salon. She looks worn, tattered. She looks a mess, but it's the best she is. She runs up to him, wraps her arms around him, and before she could even say a word, she notices that all his friends stagger back. They can't stand being around that kind of person. And even her son pushes her aside, and they leave. But she overhears the guy saying to her son, "Who's that woman?" And he says, "I've never seen her all my life." What do you think his name is? Peter, maybe? Now, I don't know about you, but it's very easy to say, well, that's Peter, this is me. I would never do a thing like that. But remember, Peter would have said the same thing. I don't know about you, but I look back on my life, I have a few regrets, too many regrets, of things that I have done that I wish I would never have thought that I would ever do that. But I did them, ashamed of them. So if it's news to you, this is a flawed pastor. You better send him back to where he came from, darkest Africa. And those are things that if you go through them and you have even minimal regrets, it's hard to put them behind you. It's hard to go forward without them. Maybe you have gone through some similar things like that. And you scan your life and you notice, at this point, what I did, I'm not proud of it. More than that, I'm ashamed of it. I'm struggling to go on without it. Maybe you're there. You know what Peter went through. And I know what Peter went through. But thank God, we can also know what Jesus did for Peter. You see, at the Last Supper, there was a conversation between Jesus and Peter and the other disciples, again public, and Jesus said, "Simon, Simon," reverts to his previous name, "Satan has demanded to sift you like wheat." How nice of Jesus to say that to Peter at that point. What do you think Peter is thinking? What happened to me? But I have pleaded in prayer for you, Simon, that your faith should not fail. So when you have repented and turned back again to me, strengthen your brothers. I don't know if Peter knew what to do with those words. They probably came back to him later on and made a far greater impact than what it did on that night at the Lord's Supper. And now, some days later, it's on the beach. Jesus is there again with Peter and 6 of the other disciples. And again, it is at a fire. Remember the fire back in the courtyard? Here's a fire that Jesus made. And he's roasting some fish, and he's got a cake of bread there. And Jesus brings it all back. It's breakfast time. And Jesus wants to do something with Peter that will hurt, but will expose the real Peter again. Now, you see, something happened to Peter from the night of the Last Supper to this breakfast on the beach. Something happened. Something that Jesus wanted to bring out into the open. He wanted the others to see it, but he wanted Peter again, publicly, because everything he did was public. Publicly, he wanted Peter to be able to show who he now is. Jesus wanted his heart, the new Peter, to be revealed. So how does Jesus do that? All Peter needed back then to reveal who he really was for a certain person who was really considered a nobody in society to ask him the simple question, aren't you one of his followers? And Peter just crumbled. His real heart came out and he says, no, I don't even know him. And he does it 3 times. Here again, Jesus is going to use a question to see what heart Peter has now. So there it is. In chapter 21, 15 to 17, Jesus asked, Simon, do you love me more than these others do? See, it brings back vividly to the minds of all of them, Peter and the disciples, that boasting promise that Peter made. Do you love me more than any of these others do? Yes, Lord. You know I love you. What do you see in that answer that is very, very different to the way we usually would answer it? I mean, I would think that Peter would say at this moment, yes, Lord, I do. That's it. I mean, that's what I say when my wife asks me, do you love me? I say, yes, I do. What does Peter say? You know that I love you. In other words, I don't know my own heart anymore, Jesus, but you do. Makes a difference. You know that I do. Well, Jesus has a little instruction, feed my lambs. Now, that's very significant, as we'll see in a moment, but for a second time, Jesus asked him, Simon, do you love me? And he says for the second time, yes, Lord, you know I love you. Jesus doesn't give up very easily. Again, he says, feed my sheep. But then the third time, he asks him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Now Peter is hurt, it says, that Jesus would ask this question the third time. And he says, Lord, you know everything. He broadens it. You know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus says, then feed my sheep. Why is Jesus making love the issue? 3 times. Love is the issue. Is it because Jesus wants us to see that the core of the sin problem, is that we love Jesus too little? And that the core of the solution to our sinning is that Jesus loves us so much. Jesus is making the issue love here. And you know, this is no new thing. Peter's been listening to Jesus talking about love for 3.5 years. He's heard Jesus say, for God so loved the world, and going on. He heard Jesus say that if you love me, you will keep my commandments. He also said, I'm giving you a new commandment, and that is that just like I love you, you should love one another. Peter heard all that. It didn't sink in. But something happened. Something happened where Peter has actually experienced the love of Jesus. He now realizes, after he had sunk so low, and he deserved to be rejected by Jesus even as he rejected Jesus. And in that very courtyard, he saw Jesus coming out, and Jesus' eye catches his eye, and these 2 eyes meet. The difference is that in the eye of Jesus, Peter sees love. Heart-changing love. Jesus sees in Peter's eyes regret, guilt, a deceived man, who sunk lower than he could even imagine. But Peter sees in the eye of Jesus a love that says, Peter, as far as I'm concerned, our relationship, my relationship with you is of such a quality that your denying me, in my eyes, has never happened. No wonder Peter ran out there, not just shocked, but broken. Because for the first time, he not just heard about the love of Jesus, but it broke his heart, gave him hope, changed his life. And what was it that did it? The love of Jesus. I want to tell you, that's why Peter could later on write in his book and say, love covers a multitude of sins. He experienced it. Have you? Clearly, as far as Jesus is concerned, love is the main thing. The main thing. 3 times, denial is the problem, and 3 times, love is the solution. 3 times. Because love matters most. And Paul got it. 1 Corinthians 13, the last verse, which is 13, Paul says, 3 things will last forever. Do you know what they are? Faith, hope. You don't know what the third one is? Thank you. Faith, hope, and love. And then Paul has the guts to say that the biggest one of all those is love. Because Paul experienced what Peter experienced. Only this time Paul was a murderer of Christians, sinking down to the lowest you possibly could. And Jesus reached his heart with love. Just think what Jesus could have said to Peter in that question. When he says, Peter, do you love me? Simon, Simon, do you love me? Just think what Jesus could have said. He could have phrased the question and said, Simon, do you trust me? He could have said, Simon, do you believe all my teachings? He could have said, Simon, do you obey all my commandments? Do you have all the signs of the times lined up so that you will be ready when I come back the second time? Simon, do you eat kosher? Simon, do you pray 3 times a day? Now, all those things are important. Please don't misunderstand me. But the issue is that all those things Peter could be doing without loving Jesus. And the only time Peter could do those things properly, from the heart, was if he did them because he loved Jesus from the heart. Otherwise, it was moralism. Otherwise, it's superficial. Otherwise, it's religion. It is not Christ. No wonder Jesus makes such a big deal out of love. You see, love is the strongest force in the universe, and I'm not talking about just romantic love. I got that. This thing about love is the death to sin. That's why love is the winner in the great controversy between good and evil, between Christ and Satan. Love is the winner. And this same John, when he writes about love, which he does plenty in his letters, the 3 letters, the epistles in the New Testament, he writes about love so many times. This guy finally says, I'm so full of this thing about love. God is love. God doesn't just love you, He is love. You can't add anything to God that is bigger than love. Love always wins. Now, I know the word love has been morphed into all kinds of weird meanings. I know that. Our culture has distorted love to the point where we have to really concentrate hard and come up with a biblical definition of love. And that's why so many times when you talk a lot about love among Christians, their eyes roll. You talk a lot about love among many Christians, and you can get yourself labeled with the L word, liberal. I wish it was love. You could be called, you could be crucified, you could be condemned as part of the emergent church because you talk so much about love. That's a morphed love, distorted love. You cannot talk enough about the pure, true love of God. So may I remind you from Acts of the Apostles, there is nothing, how much? Nothing that the world needs so much as a manifestation through humanity of the Savior's love. Well, Jesus knew that when His love flows in, His love will also flow out. And now you know why Jesus, 3 times when He asks Peter, do you love me? 3 times after Peter says, yes, Lord, you know I do. Jesus says, feed my lambs. Care for my sheep. Feed my sheep. It's because Jesus knows that when the love issue is settled in the heart and the love of God has taken over that heart, that love will flow out. That love will be shown. In other words, Jesus says, you love me? Then you will feed my sheep, my lambs. He's talking about His church. The young ones, those who are young Christians and those who have been Christians for a while, the sheep. Do you know how this feeding happens? This is the part that I think will be most surprised by. Here is, please, let's join this laughter. I love Ruth laughing here. Please join her. I mean, she's so happy that Jesus loves her. And we're just sitting there with straight faces. Everybody be happy with Ruth. Thank you, Ruth. Bringing our church alive here. Here's Jesus speaking to Peter. He says, Peter, you dressed yourself and you went wherever you wanted to go. You remember that? You went wherever you liked. You dressed yourself. But when you're old, it's going to be different. You will, and I want you to notice, stretch out your hands. And the implication is there, if I can just add it for a moment, you will stretch out your hands to be bound in execution. Yeah. When you were young, you went wherever you wanted to. You were in charge. Oh, I'm going to miss that. Oh, no, sorry. I love that. Wow. How many of you did that when you were that age? Yeah. All right. And so here's Jesus, and He says to him, when you were young, you could go anywhere you liked. You did what you wanted to. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hands, and others will dress you. That word dress, by the way, talks about binding. It's talking about what happened when somebody was taken to be crucified, and they had to stretch their arms out, and they were bound, they were dressed with ropes by tying them to the crossbar. That's what it's talking about. They'll dress you and take you where you don't want to go, to the hill where you will be crucified. Now, Eusebius is the old 4th century Christian historian who tells us that Peter was in fact crucified upside down. It's not myth, it's tradition, but it comes out of the historians' writings of the 4th century. And he's the one that tells us that when Peter was, during the time of Nero, who was persecuting the Christians, that Peter was one of them. He was a victim. He became a casualty. And they wanted to crucify him, and he says, no, I'm not worthy of being crucified. I will be crucified upside down. It comes from Eusebius. It's historical. And there he is standing, and they open his arms, his hands are stretched out, and they're tying ropes around his arms and the crossbeam. And then they flip the cross over, and he's hanging head down into the ground. You see, stretch out your hands was a way of saying that person is going to be crucified because their arms are stretched out. Sometimes they were nailed, sometimes they were tied with ropes. The arms stretched out. It's actually a metaphor for how we as Christians should live our lives. Yeah. Because not just like Peter have I denied my Lord. Not just like Peter has the love of my Lord conquered my heart. But like Peter, my Lord says to me, follow me and be one who would feed my sheep, my lambs, care for them. And the way you do that is with your hands, your arms stretched out. Because when your arms are stretched out in the crucified position, and by the way, Dietrich Bonhoeffer said that when Christ calls us to follow him, he calls us to come and die. Jesus said, if you're going to follow me, what does he say? Deny yourself, take up your cross daily and follow me. There's no other way of following Jesus. Because as you follow him on the cross, your hands are outstretched, you're exposed, you're vulnerable. Your time is exposed for others to use. Your schedule is exposed. You see, earlier on, you lived with your arms folding, hugging yourself, and you're living for yourself, and all that matters is making yourself happy. But when you follow Jesus, your arms go out and you're stretched out for others to serve them. Now it's a life of service. Self doesn't matter anymore. Feeding means bringing them to Jesus. Let them feed on the bread of life. Caring for them is showing them the way to the Savior who says, come unto me, all who are burdened and heavy laden. I will give you rest. But you cannot do it without it costing you. You cannot do it unless it's going to be self-exposing, without pain, without something that's going to hurt you. Like one said, religion that gives nothing, costs nothing, and suffers nothing is worth nothing. Martin Luther said that. There's a preacher who was asked to come and give a series of Bible talks to a school of high school students. And as this preacher had come and spoke to these students there in their chapel, the teacher in the class said to the students, if you have anything you want to talk to the preacher about, maybe an issue in your heart or something, then feel free. Just go and see him. There's the office. He's available. Well, from that day on, he was kind of inundated, and he noticed how from 12-year-old to 16-year-old young people would come and line up and come and sit in his office and speak about their biggest concern. And he noticed something. It was a pattern. And he says that as he was listening to these young people unburden their hearts, most of all, they were talking about their relationship struggles. And the story was pretty much summarized by the same issue, and that is that they had this huge crush on somebody, and that other somebody just ignored them as if they didn't exist. And this was terrible in their lives. I've been through that as a teenager. What about you? I mean, that's horrible. That's worse than failing a math test, Mr. Sigsworth. And he was hearing the story told over and over again. And at first, those stories were really spellbinding. You know, everyone was so into it, and he got into it. But after he heard the same story for it sounded like 10,000 times, he thought to himself, man, I'm getting worn out. So he talks to the Lord and he says, God, I don't know, did you bring me here for this? I'm getting burned out here. I'm not getting anything out of this, just hearing the same story again and again. And can you send somebody to take me to a museum so I can go and visit a museum or something? And then that night, he gets up and he speaks about this passage of Peter. And as he reads this passage, here's what he reads. He reads it and he says, feed my lambs. And it was as if God was speaking to him instead of him speaking to the young people. It hit him between the eyes. He says, it knocked me flat because it felt like Jesus Christ saying to me, I don't get anything out of my relationship with you, preacher. And yet I love you. That's why I feed you. You're my lamb. Now feed these lambs of mine. Sure, it'll cost you. But have you ever thought what it cost me to bring you into the kingdom? This living with your hands stretched out only happens because the love of God has changed the heart. It cannot happen because you turn over a new leaf. It cannot happen because you discipline yourself to do it. You cannot promise yourself, this is what I'm going to do. It'll just end in failure like all Peter's failing promises. It is a supernatural work that makes that happen. It is being born again from above. It is not what religion can teach you. You don't begin to do that because you are baptized. You begin to do that because the love of God has penetrated into the deepest core of your heart. And you've discovered the solution to your sin problem is the love of God solution. And when that heart is changed, automatically your arms go out. And your wallet is now exposed for others to benefit from. Your time, your energy, your desires, your interests are all exposed for others to benefit from. It's a supernatural work. We cannot do it. So what should we do then to get there? Go to the Word of God often and look to see Jesus. And the more you look at Jesus in His Word, the more your heart will be changed by the love of Jesus for you. You find it in His Word. You dwell on His Word. You dwell your mind on the love of God until it takes over your heart. You won't be able to help but do what Peter did, and that is to turn back to Jesus and say, Jesus, you know that I love you. You know that my love for you is not perfect, but it's my whole heart. It's with all my strength. It's all my mind. I love you, and you know it.
We trust your relationship with God has been strengthened from what you have heard today. Please visit our website at www.fletchersda.org. May God give you His peace and joy.